Another, I think, key service that you do for readers and leaders in this book is talking about designing jobs that actually fit the talent you have, the people that you have. And again, nothing complex here in this idea, yet it's not as easy to practice because leaders get in this rhythm of, okay, this is the job description. I need you to do this job description. And in reality, when you get somebody in there, if you're not paying attention as a leader, you can get somebody that could lay dormant for years, not fully maximizing that role or themselves. Walk us through the challenge in the book here, this idea of designing the jobs around the people, not trying to fit the people into the role or the job.
Yeah. Let me give you an example because I think that really will illustrate it well. There's a fellow by the name of John Cave, and he works for the National Football League, the NFL. And he has really advanced the game of football in terms of the technology that the coaches use to talk to one another. But it may not have happened had he not had a boss who was willing to do exactly what you just said, where her name is Michelle McKenna Doyle. She's the CIO of the NFL. And when she came on board, she was looking at all her people and said, I've got really good people, but they're not great. And I think it's because they're not slotted to their strengths. John Kay was a perfect example of this. He was in charge of all the systems enterprise-wide. And she looked at him and she said, what he's actually really good at is building things. So why is he doing payroll systems? Like, I want him to start building things. So she says, okay, John, here's what I want to do. I want you to move here and do this. But he resisted it because it felt like a demotion. It felt like she was taking something away from him. And so she's like, trust me, you're going to be a great innovator. So what are the lessons here? Number one, I think you as a boss need to recognize that sometimes when you hire people, they lead with what they do well because they worked hard to learn how to do it, but not always what they do best. And so you want to, as a boss, be able to identify what they're actually great at and then persuade them to do the job that you can see they will really be excellent at, and also that the business actually needs. And so it's really a two-step process: is identify the strengths and then persuade the talent that you have that this is actually where you need them. And when they are willing to go there, then they're learning, they're innovative, and they move the organization forward.
Now, we don't have time to go through all of the 7 accelerants of learning and growth. This is a chapter in the book that's so fantastic, chapter number 2. But I want to highlight that. I just want to run through them real quick and then let you dive into 1 or 2 here. The right risk, become a talent developer. 2, distinctive strengths, pinpoint employees' talents and utilize them. 3, embrace constraints, use time limits to motivate and hone focus. 4, battle against entitlement. Celebrate success and be generous in helping employees fulfill their potential. 5, step back to grow. Sacrifice short-term productivity to encourage curve jumping. Give failure its due is number 6. Let employees take on uncomfortable challenges and support them through failures. And then 7, be discovery driven. Shift players on your team as their skills and talents emerge. Okay. I love number 3 because I think it really challenged my mindset, and I'm thinking of this not just as a leader, but also as a parent, as I tend to do.
Yes.
It's so rich. We have leaders that are listening. I always try to draw parenting parallels here. I want to tee you up to talk about embracing constraints. Use time limits to motivate and hone focus.
Yeah. So if you think about when you're climbing this learning curve, right as you start to move into the sweet spot of that curve, there's this tendency, in fact, there's research that's been done, is when you move to the sweet spot, you look at your people and you're like, wow, they're a high potential. Fantastic. And yet the research shows that because we're afraid that the high potentials are going to fail, we stop challenging them. We stop giving them stretch assignments. And so one of the ways that you can get people to really climb that curve quickly, because they need friction, we know that it's a law of physics that people need friction, is you give them stretch assignments, you give them constraints. And so you give them hard things to do. There's this wonderful example. Do you want me to give you an example?
I would love that. No, I love it. Yes.
Okay. So this wonderful example of, her name is Ilana Golan, and she was a fighter pilot in the Israeli military. She's and then she goes to work at Intel in Israel as an intern. So on the one hand, she's an intern, but on the other hand, she's a fighter pilot, and she's been in charge of lots of other fighter pilots. And so her boss, Ziad Hana, says, okay, I'm going to give her a stretch assignment. Like, we're going to give her something hard to do. So he says, I want you to figure out what technology is going to fall, where is technology going to advance, and where are there holes, where are there problems? Well, she discovers that verification tools, those tools that test the quality of the software, which are kind of boring, but incredibly important, are going to fall behind. She's like, great, find a solution. So she starts looking around, she looks in academia, it doesn't quite work. So yeah, it's a stretch assignment, a few, missteps here and there. But then she discovers this startup in Sweden. It's railway software. Interesting, of course, outside of the discipline. He's like, okay, test it, build a prototype, and then see what you've got. Well, it worked. Intel buys the software, and they used it for several decades going forward. And to me, the lesson here is that he gave her a stretch assignment. There was the real risk that she could fail. And I think this goes actually to number 4, which is the battle of entitlement. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't want to see people fail. We're afraid to have them fail because we're feeling emotionally entitled of wanting them to do well. And so when we're willing to give people stretch assignments, we're not only giving them the opportunity to step up and potentially fail, but we're also battling our own sense of entitlement of wanting us to just feel good that everything's working. That may feel good in the short term, but in the long run, we can't really develop people unless we're willing to let them have some type of failure.
Yeah, well, that leads beautifully. That's a great segue. I wanted to talk about number 6, which is give failure its due. You've already just really introduced this. Let's keep you going here because, again, this is not something we do as leaders naturally, the idea of promoting the opportunity to fail and not being worried about it. In fact, expecting failure because, again, Whitney, you know this from your research and writing and the people, the men and women I've been able to interview, if there's anything they all share in common is they learn their greatest lessons through failure. And yet, why as leaders are we so anti creating an environment where we expect and almost want our team to fail?
Yeah, well, I've got one word for you. It's called shame.
Yeah.
Because you think about it, we all fail all the time.
That's right.
And most of the time, we're actually okay with it.
Yeah.
We do it all the time, every day. But for what? So the question is, I think, most of the people that are listening to us have this conversation, we're bright as young kids. And there's some wonderful research by Heidi Grant Halverson who says that one of the things that happens is very young, at a very young age, people are like, you got an A on that test, you're smart, you got a B, you're dumb, or that's the implication. Mm-hmm. And so we grow up and we start to think, if I do well, then I'm good. If I don't do well, I'm bad. And so our identity starts to get tied to our doing something well. And so that happens over and over and over again. So when we get into the workforce, if something doesn't go well, instead of saying, well, we iterated it, it didn't work, let's move on, it starts to feel like a referendum on us, like our identity, like that core of who we are. And so the first step is really to be able to separate out those two and say, okay, this didn't work. Is this about this not working, or is this about my sense of self? And I think that that's a very important task. Some people are better at than others, but I think it's certainly a task that we all need to take on. And what I would say is that as a manager and as a boss, one of the best things you can do for your people is to have their back and make it safe for them to fail. And the way that you as a manager can do that is you manage your manager. So when when there's a project that comes and you're like, let's go after this, you've got to say, okay, let's do it. It's the right thing to do. There's a 70% chance, for example, that it is going to work, but there's a 30% chance that it's not. It may not work, but I still think it's the right thing to do, so that if it doesn't work, there's none of this off with their head. It's just like, we took a calculated risk. Here's what we learned. Let's move on. There's no sense of this being tied to anybody's identity. I love the quote by Zig Ziglar. Failure is an event, not a person. And that to me is so powerful.